you very much for the kind introduction, and we are delighted to have data protection experts here to discuss with us. Is it not on? No. Technique. To discuss with us the two different worlds, let's say the European bloc and the Chinese bloc, and how that works together. And but you would like to say a little introduction?
Yeah, well, I would say these are two systems. I don't know if we could say that this kind of a fight of two systems, because you have the data protection coming from the Western area and let's say low data protection or no data protection actually. It's quite interesting to compare these two systems, and this is what we are doing today.
So we have both 3-minute snapshots, and our aim is to fill you in. And for me, it's now 6 minutes for the famous or unfamous GDPR, Datenschutzgrundverordnung. And the idea is to give you something in the 6 minutes which is much more of value about what you heard the last 2 years, because there are lots of rumors and misunderstandings around data protection in Europe. So first section now is let's say, to build a ground for our discussion, what is we are talking about when we're talking about data protection in the European Union, in particular when we talk about the famous or unfamous General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. So, the first thing which is really necessary to understand, and which is in particular interesting when we compare that with China, is data protection in Europe is a question of human rights. So it really has nothing to do with IT security, it has nothing to do with hackers or all these other discussion topics we hear these days. The whole idea is to protect fundamental human rights. And to understand better where this is coming from, data protection is quite modern. And in particular in Germany, among the other European countries, we are very infamous in Germany because we are always nagging about data protection, making things complicated. But this is because of our history. So it's deep-rooted in the society. We experienced the Nazi regime, where you had the conflict between the top level, the government, and the people. Then we had in East Germany the Stasi regime, and people know how it feels if someone is observing you and is knowing everything about you. And then in the 70s, first in Hesse actually, that was the first land in the world which created a data protection law, this all came up. And some of you remember the Volkszählungsurteil, public census ages ago, and just to recap what was discussed these days, it was all about the government knocking on the door, asking, let's say, simple questions like, how many people are living in the household? Do you have a parrot or do you have a dog? That was all. But everyone was on the street in '83 fighting against that law. And just imagine what everyone knows about yourself now and how the perception was back these days. Anyway, the whole conflict, when it all started, was government against people. Today, it interestingly changes. Now we have more big company versus people, and the government starts to be some kind of an ally of the people, like our data protection authorities who are supporting your rights, actually, your data protection rights. So there's a little shift from the tension government people to big companies or companies who do data exploitation, actually our clients, versus people. And out of that, this is necessary to understand the actual debate. Now, very quickly, what is relevant when we talk about the law? Because the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, is a piece of law, a massive law, a European law with global relevance, but we come to that at the second bit. Two things is necessary to understand. The first thing is what I already said. It's all about the nucleus is human rights, fundamental human rights, which needed to protect. And the second bit is the law is very untypical. We talk about a general prohibition with justifications. Usually when you look into law, you look for prohibitions. Can I drive here? How fast can I drive? Yes, no, prohibition. Here it's the other way around. The use of personal data is generally prohibited. You're not allowed to do anything if not there's an explicit justification. So our job as lawyers is always, when our clients want to do something, looking for justification. Do we have consent? Is there proper consent? Are there particular interests for the company, legitimate interest, allowing to do data exploitation? So this is kind of, in a nutshell, the basis, the nucleus of the GDPR. And now how it works in China.
So how it works in do you hear me? How it works in China. This buzzword, China's social credit system, sometimes is also called the social scoring system. You know, do you all know what it means? What is that? Well, okay, this is but let me explain it in some brief words. It's the first thing is it's one of them, or it is the biggest project that a government is now executing. It's one of the biggest projects in human history, actually, because it aims at collecting data from all citizens in one of the biggest countries in the world, or the biggest country maybe, with 1.4 billion persons, and not only the data of natural persons, but also of authorities, of companies. So, and the idea is you have sort of an account where your data is collected, and it's a system of scoring, as it says, where certain behavior that which is classified by the government in the end and is rated for some reason, and if your rates falls below a certain degree, it is the consequences will that you have certain sanctions, but also you can have benefits of it. But well, why is this system interesting? Because it's a sort of a system where people are, yes, surveyed, but where also the sanctions, which are the consequences of certain behavior, goes beyond what is what is in the classical penal law. So do you know what the classical penal law sanctions are? It's very simple. It's only fines, well, money, you have to pay money. The second is imprisonment, and the third, in some countries, it's death. But that's all. You don't have other kinds of sanctions. And what the Chinese government is introducing is that you have different levels of sanctions, which are maybe also a little bit more tied to the behavior or the bad behavior that you do, like you cannot book certain travels, maybe you cannot use the highway, your kids cannot apply for certain schools, and it's more diversified, I would say. So what is the background of this system? So the buzzwords. Oh, the buzzwords here in the Western. Do I have to shift it to you again? The buzzword is like dystopia, surveillance, but I'm not sure if this is the only background. So if we have time, I will introduce a little bit what could also be the background.
Thank you very much. You have to ask the right question so that we can come back to that system. But what I can say is this social scoring system would be never compatible with the GDPR. So we really have a kind of a clash of traditions and societies in that respect. So just 1 minute, my key message for you, what is really relevant about the GDPR, about the data protection law. I can say what is irrelevant. It's irrelevant what you read in the papers. It's just nonsense. The whole talk about big and huge fines and the whole talk about Abmahnwelle and all that was rubbish. There are no law firms specialized on chasing data protection infringements. And the fines, compared to fines in other areas, are very low. The data protection authorities, they're completely understaffed and overworked. They're very happy if they're not must pose a fine. So that's all rubbish. But what is it all about? It's all about competitiveness. And this is something what you never read. People believe when they hear about data protection, it's really very boring, it's compliance, you have to do your homework and maybe one day it goes away. And then I can ignore it. Now we go into the digital world where I can do whatever I like. But that's wrong, because you have to understand data protection as integral part of the digitalization. It's really, you cannot go digital without data ethics as a kind of balance of interest. And it's in the law, but we experience that with our clients. If you go, so I think it's a future topic. It's not a topic looking backwards. So my message is, it's part of the digital world, and the second message is, it's global. It's not just European. The GDPR is running global. It's in the US now. It's copied by Californian law. You have it in Brazil. Japan is taking part. So it's really a global phenomenon.
Yeah, and also China starts now to copy some certain elements from the GDPR. So the last minute now, I have a thesis why the system, or about this background of the system, of the China credit system. It's state surveillance, and the functioning of the state in China is does not work as well as one thinks in the Western, because it's a huge country. And the state fails in different areas like food safety, like environmental protection, and like execution of court judgments. It does not function. And the idea behind the system is also to skip the process of building up these state organs and this state organization in a classical way, by building up, by having more controlling authorities, by having more persons, by having more policemen. But to skip this and to directly go to a system with digitization. So by collecting data and by building up a new system of surveillance, which are not that dependent from manpower. So, okay.
Thank you so much. We started a bit earlier, so we had some, yeah. Okay, a bit more time. Well, we have 6 minutes for your questions now, but let me ask you one question first, because when I talk to correspondents, they always tell me, okay, the Chinese people, they like the social credit system. And being born in the GDR, my parents told me, well, we always had like a public opinion and a private opinion. How is it in China, actually?
Yes, it is very difficult to know the private opinion in China, because you don't really have sources. There are studies. There are also a study of the University in Berlin from last year, which, according to the study representative, and they said that 80% of the Chinese people are pro this system. They think this is a good system because it builds up trust in society, and it, in the end, really fills out this need to have surveillance and control in the state. So we don't know if this is actually the real opinion of the entire people, but usually what is very interesting is that there are no traces of really negative opinions also in the social media. And usually if you have something that the people doesn't like, you would have at least some traces, and you don't have this with regard to this system. So maybe it's really it's really accepted by the people.
So now I'm very curious about your question. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Johannes from the HASPA Next. So a friend of mine traveled to China last year, a digital expert, very versed in the stories about what you talked about, and outraged before her travels. And she came back and said to her it seemed like people were almost, I mean, unaware is too strong a word, but she was meeting with digitals over there, and they seemed either not to care, or in large parts not even to know the scope and the breadth of the system. So how about awareness in China? Is this hyped up in Western media? Or is it hyped down in Chinese media? How do you see this?
So I'm not sure if it is intentionally hyped down in China. I'm not sure about that, but my impression is also that it's a little bit hyped in the Western media more, or the concerns are, there are more concerns in the Western area because also of the history, of the recent history, especially in Germany, as you said, Axel. And in China, okay, there's less discussion about history because there has also been history, but in general, it seems more like something which is in Western media.
If your colleague would go to the Silicon Valley, they don't care either. So it's not a big difference in the digital world somewhere else. So it's more like the let's say Piratenpartei and those who are Chaos Computer Club, who are experts and looking critical on that topic, but the business as such is more like looking at data protection as a means of how can I, let's say, exploit, and I don't want to give this a negative connotation, how can I work with personal data without infringing the law? That's the key question. But there's no real concern in a way that they say, this is really the right way we are going at the moment. And at the same time, we have to, this is how I'm treated. This is true diversity with Taylor Wessing. Stamped on the name tags. Thank you. But then again, in China, we have in the startup area, this China, Silicon Valley, Beijing, Shanghai, we have more and more companies, as you already said, because it's more a global phenomenon. They want to go to Europe, and they start to have concern, not so much from a private perspective as a person, but more from a legal compliance perspective.
Okay. Next question.
Yes, I was wondering, you said something earlier that basically in Germany you're not allowed to use any data except you have a good excuse somehow.
Not excuse, justification.
Oh, justification. And which is the total opposite to China, right? And I was wondering, why is it so hard then in Germany to use data in the medical context? Because that is a good justification, right?
Well, good question. Medical data is sensitive data. I give you an example. You have a sport tracker and you track every day you jog, and then you track, and then you're very happy and you get this information. You say, this is really interesting information. So, but at the same time, your doctor gets this information, and your doctor can read something's weird. You rather have a control check. And I would say, positive, very good, I like it. But also your insurance company, health insurance, got the same information, and then you get a check and they say you rather go into a different class. Or someone else get that information, your employer, for example, and they realize something's probably wrong in the health area. Maybe next time when we have to lay off some people, you are in that bucket. So there's a big chance of misuse, and everything we talk about under the European data protection law comes from what you earlier said, from that experience that it can be misused. So the potential misuse, it's not so visible yet, but it's definitely there. And therefore you have the law.
Yeah, I would be interested in one simple question. Do private companies in China have access to the data that is collected by the government? So, for example, can Tencent or Alibaba get access to the publicly collected data? And if so, is the collecting of the data more a political decision or more an economical decision?
So this is, yeah, I'm taking care, and I have to say I don't know if this is the case, if companies have access to the data. In the opposite way, I would say if the government would like to have data of private companies, it should be possible. But I don't think that this is really this has an economic background, but really more political and background regarding society and stability in society. I don't think that this is really necessary that the government collects the data, because the companies themselves do collect enough data. Maybe, but it's just a guess with disclaimer.
Thank you.
We have one more question. Okay.
And in the Chinese system, is the data publicly available? So can I look up my neighbor? Is he a good man or not? Is this possible, or is it only secret and limited to the government?
So far, I have to say I'm not sure, but I don't think so. I don't think that the data is also can also be seen or is disclosed to everyone, but only to the government. But
I think there's a mix, because you have these phenomenon that if someone is walking, trespassing the streets, then this person is filmed and then displayed in public to blame. And in schools, when you get bad marks, you know why you get bad marks. So there's a little element of transparency, but I don't think the full transparency you are talking about.
I don't think that there's a data bank somewhere where you can check online the account of all other persons. I don't think so. Would be quite krass.
All right, then. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening.